Well, it's a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce Donald Keene to you, I know that you know him very well, but nonetheless, I know you know him through his scores of books and translations, lectures, and teachings about Japanese literature and culture. I think it's fair to say that there is no one who knows the culture of Japan in the West in the breadth and depth that Donald Keene does. And Japanese frequently say that there is no one like him in Japan either, which would pretty much make him the only person in the world who knows what he knows and conveys it with such exquisite passion. The lifetime of scholarly and literary achievement is a product of Professor Keene's sensibilities and his sensitivity, his feelings for Japan, for its history and for its people, and also the product of a prodigious amount of very hard work. For his monumental 4-volume History of Japanese Literature, Professor Keene read everything. Everything. This was a history published in both Japanese and English, and in order to write it, he read major and minor works. He read works that were very famous and works that no one had ever heard of except him and maybe the person who wrote it. And he did that all before he began to write. And then when he wrote elegantly, and it was always elegantly that he wrote, these chapters that magically managed to convey the nature and content and style of the works, and also what he thought of them. What kind of literary value, what kind of human and humane value they had. Over the years, he has written as much about history as about literature, and that history ranges from history of olden times to his most recent book, which is about the wartime diaries during the Second World War. One of my favorites is The Japanese Discovery of Europe, which talks about the Japanese discovery of Europe before the opening of Japan, discovery of Europe through its works, through its art, and through its history. It's a classic and still widely read. The translations that Professor Keene has produced, beginning with the most important in terms of introducing Japanese literature to Western readers, that was the Anthology of Japanese Literature in 1955, a volume that is still in print and still selling. He's translated all kinds and all genres and all periods of literature. No plays, Chikamatsu, Mishima Yukio, Abe Kobo, many, many more, too many to mention. And those translations have succeeded, actually, in making Japanese literature known to Western readers, not only readers of English, but readers of other European languages. The diaries that he translated and introduced in his books, The Travelers of 100 Ages, introduced the whole genre of the Japanese diary in a way that were absolutely beguiling, 2 large volumes. And when I say prodigious, I have to add that many of these works were produced as weekly installments published in Japanese newspapers and journals. I don't know of any scholar who can write scholarship to a news media deadline. But that's how the diaries were produced. And the books that come out of this weekly, monthly, rigorous work are always enchanting. Now, Professor Keene has been honored in manifold ways, decorations from the Japanese government, including the highest, the Bunka Kunsho. I asked him just earlier whether he was the first foreigner to receive the Bunka Kunsho from the government, and I was told no, that it had been given once before to the men who stepped onto the moon. So that's the caliber of his achievement. He's honored by readers across the globe. His name is known in many countries. We all know that the name Donald Keene has a kind of incantatory effect in many places. because of the translations and his books. And he is above all honored by his many, many students who, like me, have received the gift of his enthusiasm and feeling for Japanese culture. Professor Keene came to Columbia as a student before the beginning of World War II between the United States and Japan. He came back for graduate study, and then after a short time away, he came back, returned, and joined the faculty. He retired in 1992. By my count, that's almost 20 years ago. And since then, he has returned every spring from Japan to teach his course in Japanese literature. This year, that course, which is very famous, had what has now become known in Columbia and also in the New York Times as Donald Keene's last class. And that was an occasion for sadness on the part of students, but also for celebration. And many of his former students came back and to celebrate and honor him. And when you heard their words, you realized yet again what an inspiration, what a gift, and what generosity of spirit Professor Keene has exhibited over the years in his teaching, which has always been fundamental, and his loyalty to Columbia, which is also a very deep part of him. He's equally devoted to Japan. He has spent 8 months of the year in Japan since around 1970, coming back for the spring semester at Columbia. And so his returning now to Japan full-time is something that follows quite naturally from his decades of living in Japan. We're fortunate to have Professor Keene here for this conversation. It is billed as a farewell evening. Many of us hope this is farewell for now, and that it will not be Donald Keene's last lecture. But I'm glad you're here to join me in welcoming Donald Keene, celebrating his 73 years at Columbia. Yes, wow is right. Mm-hmm. His 73 years at Columbia and his, yeah. And most important, to celebrate his work and his life. So please join me in welcoming Professor Keene. This is going to be an informal conversation, and it's mostly devoted, I hope, to Donald Keene's engagement with and enthusiasm for Japanese literature and culture, and I think his life is so intertwined with that engagement and enthusiasm that we will hear about his life as well as about his works. But I'd like to start with the question that you are always asked. And so I'm not going to make an exception. I see no reason to make an exception. And the question is, how did this start?
How did it start?
Yes, how did it start?
It started, I can almost give you the date it started. My education, up to the point of this great event in my life, had been normal in that I learned almost nothing about Japan. I thought that I'd received a very good education, and indeed I had received a very good education in the West. There was never any mention of literature existing outside the West. If Japanese history was mentioned at any point, it was always in connection with one thing only, and that was Commodore Perry having opened Japan. Nothing, what did he open was never described. And I thought this was normal. It didn't occur to me to be curious and ask, didn't the Japanese have literature? That question never arose. But my first year at Columbia, I took the class called Humanities, which was taught by a great scholar and poet, Mark Van Doren. A wonderful experience for anyone, and for a freshman, it was extraordinary. But even more important in the end than Mark Van Doren's wonderful lectures was the fact that we were seated alphabetically in the class. And so K for Keene was seated next to L for Lee, and the Lee was the Chinese. He was the first Chinese I'd ever spoken to, as far as I know. I had never been particularly interested in China, with the exception of postage stamps. I collected stamps since I was interested to that degree in China and in Japan too. But gradually, as we became friendly, seeing each other 4 days or 5 days a week from 9 to 10, I became interested in him, and we agreed to meet and have lunch together at the local Chinese restaurant, where we ate every single day egg foo young and fried rice. And we ate that because they were the cheapest things on the menu, 25 cents each. He was a very likable person, and he became, my closest friend when I was in college. But his greatest gift to me was it was a mixed gift, in that I asked him to teach me. I wanted to learn Chinese characters, and he taught me characters. It started off with 1, 2, 3. If you know characters at all, 1, that's easy. 2 is easy. 3 is very easy. 4 becomes more difficult. But I became fascinated with these things, and I became desirous of knowing more. But he refused to teach me any pronunciations because he thought that I should learn standard Chinese pronunciation and not Cantonese dialect. And so I learned character without having any idea how they were sounded, or whether they were old words or new words, nothing at all. But I was collecting them as I collected postage stamps. And the more strokes in a character, the better I liked it. Just the way I liked a postage stamp which had heavy overprint of 25 cents on it, or something of that sort. In any case, that was the very beginning. But that still didn't lead me to Japanese literature, which happened 2 years later, 1940. 1940 was a genuinely terrible year. I don't think there's ever been a worse year in the history of mankind. What happened in 1940? It started off with the Nazi armies invading Norway, followed by Denmark, Holland, Belgium, France. And in that year, the Battle of Britain, the nightly bombing of London, other cities in England. To read the newspaper was a strain. It was a nightmare. Every day there was another city that had fallen to the Germans. It seemed likely to me that England would have to capitulate and that the United States would be next. One day, in this early summer of 1940, I walked, as I often did, through Times Square, looked at it, and there was a bookshop on the ground floor of the Hotel Astor, a hotel which has since been demolished, where they sold remainders. That is to say, not old books, but new books that had overprinted or hadn't sufficiently sold. And there I saw 2 volumes boxed, something called The Tale of Genji. I had never heard of this book, and my education never extended to it. I didn't know what it was. I took it down from the shelf, and I guessed from the illustration it had probably something to do with Japan. But it tempted me, and I bought it for a simple reason: 2 volumes for 49 cents. And I took this home, expecting I would probably not read it for quite a while, but I started to read it anyway. And this became literally my salvation from the newspapers, from the horrible things that were going on in the world. This was a world of fiction, it's true, but it was a beautiful world, and it was something I was craving and wanted to know more about. A world where everything was made beautiful, whether the house, the furnishings, or even just the way people spoke. People didn't speak in ordinary prose, but in poetry. It was such a tantalizing view, and so unlike the world I was living in, the hateful world in which I was doomed to live, when people could have lived in a world like that of the Tale of Genji. This is 1940. 1941, I was once again eating at the Chinese restaurant, or I had just eaten there, when a man I'd never seen before came up and said, "You eat the Chinese restaurant every day, don't you?" I said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "Will you have dinner with me tonight?" And I said, I thought about it, will I have enough money to eat twice in one day at the restaurant? Well, I said, all right. And he told me that he had taught English in Taiwan, which was then a Japanese possession, and he had never learned Japanese properly. But one of his former students had American citizenship, and this young man was return to America, and he would be available as a tutor in Japanese. My new friend said if he studied all by himself with the tutor, he probably wouldn't work very hard. It'd be better to have several other people together. There would be a certain amount of competition, and if one wanted to be lazy, the other two might induce him to work harder. And so that is what happened. I went for the summer, 2 months, to the mountains of North Carolina, where my friend had a house, and there was our Japanese tutor and 3 people. The other 2 were much older than myself. I was 19. The others were 29 and perhaps 45. The one who was 45 had been born in Japan and learned Japanese as a boy, but then left Japan. He could still speak Japanese, but couldn't read it. And his Japanese was obviously that of a boy of 10 or whatever it was. The other one, my friend, had lived in Japan and knew enough for conversation, but had never been able to read it. The other 2 soon got tired of trying to learn Japanese characters, but I was fascinated by them, and I enjoyed it very much. This was in August, shall we say, 1941. In December 1940, I returned to Columbia University for my senior year, and I decided to take a class with Tsunoda Ryusaku, who was my teacher, who became my lifetime sensei, my teacher. When I first went to the classroom, he was there, but nobody else was there. And I realized I was the only student. And I felt sorry for him to teach to someone who knew nothing about Japan. And so I said, I will drop the course. And he said, no, 1 is enough. And 1 was enough for him. When I came to the class the next time, the board would be covered with writing, mainly things in classical Chinese, which I couldn't read. He'd also have a stack of books like that in front of him, just in case I asked a difficult question. I was quite incapable of asking any questions. And he lectured beautifully, and I was absolutely fascinated. After a time, 2 other people joined the class. It wasn't quite such a one-man performance, but it was an unforgettable experience. And then, as you all know, during that term, on December 7th, war broke out. As it happened, December 7th, I went with my Japanese tutor to Staten Island for hiking there. We came back, it was a Sunday, we came back and they were selling newspapers. The New York, what was it called? It was the only newspaper that was published on Sunday afternoon. And it said, Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor or something. I thought it was a joke. The newspaper itself was noted for its sensational headlines. Flood to wipe out New York. Or other things of that sort. And so I didn't take it seriously, but I should have. And then the next stage of my career was joining the United States Navy Japanese language school, which was in Berkeley, California, where I had extremely intense teaching, 6 days a week, 4 hours a day, and a lot of preparation to do, and not one word about the Navy was ever spoken. So that when I first went on a ship, I knew nothing about it. Anyway, that's my beginnings.
I see.
At length.
No, well, actually, that's, considering the time when people didn't study Japan, you were lucky to find Tsunoda Sensei.
Yes.
You were lucky to be at Columbia because
Yes.
there was someone who
Yes.
could teach you. The tale of Genji, then, I think I remember hearing that when you were in the Navy in Hawaii, that you and some other fellow students from the Japanese language school actually were reading the Genji in Japanese when you were supposed to be being Navy men. Is that right?
No, we weren't quite that irresponsible. We had 1 day off a week, and I argued with the people who ran such things that it would be the same thing if I had 2 half days off a week. And they finally agreed to that. And so I asked the professor at the University of Hawaii, Professor Uehara, if he wouldn't teach us the tale of Genji. There were 3 or 4 of us. And he had never read it himself, in the original, that is. And he was doubtful, but anyway, we did it. And it was a very important experience for me, in that by this time I was very, very self-confident. I thought I could read anything in Japanese. I studied Japanese, graduated from the Navy Language School. I could read a newspaper and a magazine and so on, but I couldn't read Tale of Genji. It was absolutely beyond me. It took me an hour to read each sentence, and even then I wasn't sure. I made up my mind not to look at the translation, otherwise it wouldn't have been fair. But it was an agony, and it made me realize there was a lot more to Japanese literature than what I knew. When you were in the Navy, you read the diaries of captured Yes.
Japanese soldiers, and that must have meant you were reading script.
Yes.
And could you read that handwritten script?
Yes, I've always been interested in handwriting, and at the school, the Navy school, I was at the Navy school for 11 months. Later on, they decided this was not long enough. It was increased to 14 months, 15 months, and as the quality of the students went down finally to 18 months to do the same thing. But the last thing we learned was to read difficult writing. It was only just the beginning, because each person has a different kind of difficult writing. But when I first started to translate at the Navy office in Pearl Harbor, I was given documents which were instructions on how to operate a certain kind of machine, which I'd never seen before. I had no idea what it was. And none of the words I wanted to know were in the dictionary. Or I was given a list of all the officers of a certain regiment, and I was told to put these all into Roman letters. Well, most of them were not in any dictionary of proper names, and so after a while I just got so tired, and I said, well, that no one will ever know. And I gave all of them the same name. But then I discovered there were certain documents that nobody else wanted to read. They didn't want to read them first of all, because they had a bad smell, or some of them did. The bad smell, I later discovered, was from bloodstains. These were diaries that had been taken from the bodies of Japanese soldiers, or sometimes they were found in the sea, floating in the water, and of course the writing would be blurred. But I started to read the cleanest ones without any blood on them, and then I discovered how extraordinarily interesting it was. And there were certain things that were repeated from diary to diary, so I could gather, well, even if my knowledge of written Japanese were not adequate, at least I could gather certain things quite easily. And this became my special thing. I was, at the end of the war, I was given a very small decoration by Admiral Nimitz for my reading of Social, a script of cursive script.
Well, I believe you did not get a decoration for having conquered the Aleutians, although I think you tried. Yes, we'll pass over your martial past, and let me now just change and ask you. You began with the tale of Genji. What, in addition to the Genji and this sort of wonderful world, bygone world of the court, what was it about Japanese literature which parts of Japanese literature attracted you in the early days?
In the early days, I couldn't read Japanese well enough to read a novel for pleasure. I could read it. At the University of Hawaii, I took another course. We read one novel each week and wrote a report on it in Japanese. I still have one of my reports left from that reading it. They were novels that were popular in the 1920s. But these were not the very best fiction available. And it wasn't, I read most of the things I enjoyed in translation. Even if the translation was not a good translation, I could find something in it that appealed to me. Well, obviously such things as the Japanese love of nature, which would appear both in poetry and in prose, and it was so much a part of Japanese expression and feeling that it was impossible not to be moved by it. And a very simple thing that was, in a sense, hard to learn was that human nature is really very much the same in different parts of the world, different times. You can read the tale of Genji and sympathize with the people without thinking these people lived 1,000 years ago. You don't have to think that these people never heard of the West and they had nothing to do with Greece and Latin and Rome. Our backgrounds were quite different, but the Japanese literature was prevailingly one of the emotion. Mm-hmm. I did not find that, I must confess, in Chinese literature. It exists, but it doesn't seem to be so important as in Japanese. And for that reason, I think, when I first got my Chinese friend to recommend a Chinese work of literature, he recommended to me the Analects of Confucius. And I thought, that I still had prejudices in those days. I thought, is this philosophy? Is it literature? This is certainly not the equivalent of Plato. But it was, but I think that in the case of Japan, Japanese literature, I had no feeling of defense or feeling uncertain or feeling that it was a different world. I was associating with these people. I understood them. They called out to me. And this feeling persisted with Japanese literature and does to this day. I have never felt that, well, that's the way that person thinks, but after all, they're Japanese and I'm not. I've never had that feeling.
Mm-hmm. And when you began with Chikamatsu, did you? The battles of Kaksinga, what did you begin with?
Yes, after the war ended, a group of us, let's say there were 6 or 8, who had learned Japanese during the war and wanted to go on with it, returned to Columbia. At that time, Tsunoda Sensei was the only person teaching Japanese literature or history or philosophy. The reason was that all the other professors of those subjects were in Japan. They were with the occupation. And so Tsunoda Sensei had the whole responsibility for everything of a cultural nature. And he said, what would you like to read? And there was a division. Some people, like myself, wanted to read Heian literature. read the Tale of Genji in the original again, but this time with better knowledge. Other people wanted to read the literature of the Buddhist literature, of the Buddhist priests of the Middle Ages. Still others want to read the Genroku literature. Tsunoda Sensei could teach anything. He was a Meiji period Japanese. He had read all these things as a child. There was no problem for him. He couldn't see why we couldn't read it just as well as he could. And so he taught us all. We had 3 different literature classes, one on Heian literature, one on medieval literature, Tsurezurusa, works like Hojoki, and then on Genroku literature. And in Genroku literature, we read the 3 great writers. We read Saikaku. I think it was the only time in the history of the West that a class read the entire 5 Women Who Love Love from beginning to end in the original. We also read Oku no Hosamichi Basho, and we read Chikamatsu, who was the 3rd, the Battle of Kokusen. We only read the first act, however. It wasn't time for any more. In addition, Tsunoda Sensei, as usual, taught history and Japanese thought. We were exploiting him horribly. But I think at the same time, it must have given him a kind of pleasure after the war to see young Americans who wanted desperately to learn as much as possible about his country. It was, for him, it was a very, very painful thing for Japan to have lost the war. It would have been just as painful if America had lost the war. If you love 2 countries, that's a danger. But to have the young people who wanted so much to learn, we hadn't learned really for 4 years, and we wanted to learn. And even now, when a student doesn't come to a class of mine, I feel angry. Not because of me, but because they're missing this chance. They'll never have it again in their whole lives. They don't know the value of this 1 hour, which they might be the only chance to hear about Chikamatsu, whoever it was. But anyway, we were a very, very special group of people, and I naturally, when I was doing my MA essay and then my PhD thesis, I turned to things that Tsunoda Sensei had taught me.
And so you turned to Kokusenga.
Kokusenga was I took this play. I had another meeting, a version for it. I confess it now. It's not a very admirable thing. I was running out of money, and I heard that the Chinese government was willing to give money, scholarships, to people who had served in China during the war. I had, or just after the end of the war. I've been in China for 3 months. And so I thought I would do something. And then what can I do in Chinese that, and at the same time, not abandon Japanese? And then I thought of the Battle of Kokusen, which has a title in Japanese, Chichi wa Morokoshi, Haha wa Nippon, Kokusenya. Well, he was half Chinese and half Japanese, and therefore he was a perfect person for me to choose. And I therefore read this play of Chikamatsu, which cannot be taken seriously as history.
I see. And then you've done interested early in Heian and Genroku, and when did you begin to translate and to read modern Japanese fiction? Rather early, no?
Not so early. It was, apart from that time at the University of Hawaii when I read them as a classroom assignment, my first position was in England, Cambridge University. And there the tradition was entirely in terms of classicals. I don't think the library contained any modern novels. You assumed that they were not to be reread. Just you buy them, throw them away. And so I was in that mode, shall we say. And I thought I'd go to Japan and write a book about Basho. Not so long after I arrived in Japan, I found an ideal place to live in Kyoto. And one day the landlady, who became a great friend of mine, said, "What newspaper do you take?" And I said, "I have no time to read newspapers," which was a really perfect answer for someone in Cambridge. But then I became friendly with a man who lived next door, who became my closest friend in Japan, Nagai Michio, who became the Minister of Education not so long after. And it was because of his influence that I felt that I had to learn about the modern Japan. And he took me to election meetings to listen to people giving speeches. We did all kinds of things together. He wanted me to know how important modern Japan was, living Japan. And that's when I became really interested in reading modern Japanese literature.
And the first novel you translated was what? The first?
The first novel I translated a number of short stories or excerpts from novels, but the first novel, a whole novel that I translated, was Dazai's novel, The Setting Sun. It was a weird experience for me. I assumed that translating Japanese would be difficult, and certainly a novel, and it was extremely easy. I don't know how it happened. This was my first year of teaching at Columbia. My first year of teaching at Columbia wasn't the whole thing. It was my first year as a human being having a social life. I went out, and in the evenings, I for the first time drank. I did all kinds of other things that I hadn't done at all. And yet I managed to translate this book without any trouble at all. People said it must be because you are like Dazai Osamu, the author. I don't think so at all. But somehow the way he expressed himself, what he was talking about, was so easy for me that it was a joy to translate.
And that wasn't too many years after, I mean, the book was 1948, right?
That's right. It wasn't too many. It was about 5 years after that.
So after that, then, you actually divided your time, didn't you, between modern works and more traditional works? When did you translate Tsurezuri Gusa, which is one of the great translations?
That was somewhat later.
Essays in Idleness.
But it was, I think you're right. Another thing that happened was that while I was in Japan, I got to meet the authors. And that was an extraordinary experience for me, although I didn't realize just what experience it was. I got to know Tanizaki. I had read his novel, Sasame Yuki, the
Makioka Sisters.
The Makioka Sisters. When it came out, Tanizaki had sent a copy to Arthur Whaley. And because I think Whaley was the great translator of Genji, and Tanizaki thought, this is my Genji, I'd like to have him translate this. Whaley, after reading it, gave it to me. I said, what did you think of it? Oh, it was rather flat. So I didn't expect much, but I read it with great interest, excitement. In fact, he was the only, when I arrived in Japan, he was the only living author whose name I knew. And I had occasion to, he was living in Kyoto and so was I, and I had occasion to visit him, and we became friendly. I can't say we were friends because I was, say, 25 and he was about 75. But he was very friendly to me, and his wife was absolutely enchanting. And knowing him made me want to know more about Japanese literature as a whole. And then not immediately, but I got to know Japanese authors of my age, like Mishima or Abe Kobo, who became very close friends and whose works of different kinds I translated.
And so you became very close friends with Mishima and Abe, and you met Tanizaki. And who are the other authors whom you met over the years that you treasure either their works or their acquaintance?
Well, the rarest one I met was Nagai Kafu. Nagai Kafu was an eccentric. I met him in this way. My friend, who was the publisher of Chuo Corns, or the president who published my books, said he was going to see Corfu. Would I like to go along with him? And I said, I could hardly say no to that. So we went to a place in Chiba-ken, and we got out of the car because the street was too narrow for a car to go through. And we went into a house which had no sign on it, nothing at all. And we went in and we called out, and an old lady came out, and she said, come in. And we took off our shoes. We sat down. Well, as you probably know, Japanese often say, my place is dirty or something like that. Kitanai toko desu, you know. But this place really was dirty. Clouds of dust came up. And then into the room came a most unattractive man. His front teeth were all missing. His clothes were in a state of great disarray, shall we say. And this was Nagai Kafu. And he started to talk, and it was the most beautiful Japanese I'd ever heard. And I thought, if I could talk like that, I would die happy. And I was just, it didn't matter what he said, I was just absorbed by it. I didn't know the Japanese could sound so beautiful. It really was glorious. I translated his story, Sumidagawa. It's a fairly long story. And he read my translation. We all know that Corfu was crazy about France and that he read French easily, but he also knew English quite well. He spent some years in New York and then in Kalamazoo, Michigan. But I was really very, very happy to meet him. Other writers I met were writers I was perhaps not so famous now, but were very famous then. There was Kinoshita Junji, who was a playwright, and he wrote a play about a crane which takes human form and is married to a man. So it's a folk play which he derived from original Japanese literature, medieval Japanese literature, but he had changed it, and it was the most popular work at the time. Yuzu, as the play was called, was performed as a play, as an ordinary play. It was performed as a kabuki play. It was rewritten as an opera. It was done as a dance play. Everything was Yuzu. This was the first bright thing after the war in new Japanese literature. And so...
when was that, 1950s? When was that?
It was 1953.
Yeah.
And it was... I met him and Kinoshita, and it was very pleasant. We got along very well, but we had different ideas. I was trying to find people who were interested in, not in the medieval folk tales, but in the earlier Heian literature, and using Heian literature in writing modern works. And he was not interested in that. But I did meet somebody before long who was, and that was Mishima. And so he became, for 17 or 18 years, one of my closest friends.
You said years ago, I think, and more than once, that it was your mission to make Japanese literature known to the world, to make the world knowledgeable about Japanese literature in the way that it wasn't when you first encountered it. And do you think you did?
Well, starting off by being nasty about my predecessors. Well, there's one predecessor whom I worshipped, and that was Arthur Waley. Arthur Waley was a genius. I hate to use the word genius because it's used too much, but he could do things that were just impossible. He learned both Chinese and Japanese all by himself. He translated the Tale of Genji not from a modern edition, but from a woodblock edition in the British Museum, a late woodblock edition with the characters rather smudged. And he could do things that no one else could do. But when I was beginning, he had already done his work with in Japanese some years ago. The current way of translating Japanese was to put words in brackets that were not in the original. And so, he bracket did not bracket, and it was impossible to read. And this was not one person, but almost all the scholars are doing that to show their superior knowledge of the differences between Japanese and English expression or French expression. And I couldn't read these things without feeling angry. And I determined that I would write in a way that anybody could read. When I had the idea of doing an anthology of Japanese literature, I approached a British publisher, and I had a letter. We are interested, but you must include all periods of Japanese literature, and the book must not be in more than 200 pages. I sent word back that Japanese literature was about the same length as English literature. Would you expect to put all of English literature in 200 pages? And the answer came back, we know our market better than you do. I fortunately got in touch with Grove Press, a very adventurous publishing company in those days, publishing very excellent works. And they agreed to do 500 pages. And then, thanks to the intercession of someone they asked, who was Sir George Sansom, they decided to do 2 volumes, which meant I had close to 1,000 pages instead of 200. At first I thought I would be using most of the existing translations, but most of them were so bad that I either did them myself or I found people who could translate very well and whose translations met my standards. And they included, among others, and preeminently among the others, was Edward Sardesticker.
And the anthology actually did reach the world in terms of introducing the authors. And then after that, you actually translated the full works of many of them, right?
Yes.
Like the essays in idleness and...
Yes. It's something I shouldn't say since I'm normally a very modest person. But because of the existence of this anthology of Japanese literature, it became necessary for people, let's say, in Mexico or Italy, if they wanted to learn Japanese, to learn English so that they can use the anthology. It was a requirement. You couldn't get away without English because that was the language of the anthology. But you're right. After doing the selections from some of these writers, I decided I wanted to do more than myself, or I was able to persuade other people to do this, and it was a matter of not of scholarship, because I didn't really know so much in those days, but a matter of good luck that the choices that I made for works to be included were all things that I could stand up for today. They seem still to be very representative works of different periods of Japanese literature.
Your favorites?
Excuse me?
Your favorites are what?
My favorites are the works. Well, I'll give it a strange example. It's in the second volume of the anthology. It's the Romaji Diary of Takuboku. This again was one of those pieces of good luck that I've been blessed with. I had an appointment one day with Professor Kuwabara Takeo of Kyoto University. I went to his house, and he had a little red book, not Mao's book, but another one. And he said, "Have you seen the new edition, the Iwanami edition of Takuboku?" And I said, "No, I haven't." And he said, "Well, you should read the Romaji Diary." And I read the Romaji Diary, and I was knocked out. Takuboku I knew as a poet, and a very interesting poet, a likable poet, but as a writer about himself, about his his daily life, he's fantastic. And there's nothing separating me from him. He's absolutely today. He writes in the morning, he writes something, what I consider the most important thing in life is, and then later on the same page, what I wrote this morning was a lie. You say, why did I write this diary in Roman letters instead of in Japanese? It's because I love my wife and I don't want to hurt her feelings. He said, no, it's not that. It's true that I love her, and it's true that I don't want to hurt her feelings, but the two things are not the same. But that sort of thing I've never seen before in almost any literature, and there it was. And that was that excitement of finding a work which, until that Professor Kuwabara noticed it, had been passed over, which is not mentioned by anybody. Yeah. That was the kind of excitement that I felt. And then in the first volume, the work that became a part of me in many senses, it was Basho's Oku no Hosomichi, the narrow road to the north. This work has just stayed with me all those years. In 1955, I actually took the trip that Basho had taken. I intended to walk all the way, and I was young enough, so this was possible. But there was one thing I didn't think about, and that was, in those days, Japanese roads were not paved. And this meant that every time a truck went by, a cloud of smoke would come up. I'd be gasping. I couldn't breathe. And finally, I gave up and took bus instead. But it's come back to me every time, and it's just now. Next week, I will have a telephone interview with somebody about the fact that the great temple Chusonji, which I visited on that journey, which was not harmed during the earthquake and the tsunami. This has been declared one of the World Heritage Sites. And what did I think of it? Well, I'm very happy, of course. But this experience of Basho, of reading Basho, and translating him over and over. My first translation, which I was very pleased with, I showed to a professor at Columbia, who said to me bluntly, "You told me this was very interesting, but I found it rather boring." Well, he was right. He was right because what I had translated was not the original, but the modern Japanese translation at the bottom of the page, which had all kinds of explanations in it, and destroyed the subjective what I'm trying to say, suggestive power of Basho's very lean statements. But I translated over and over again, once another time in the anthology, another time for another reason, and then not so long ago for an illustrated edition. But each time I feel more deeply than ever the beauty of that work.
And I took the class when we translated Basho, and we were, I mean, it was so stunning for us because we couldn't do what you could do, which is to never miss a word, but never have it sound as if you're translating literally. This incredible, the suggestiveness that you got, it was a very demoralizing experience for us. They were very short passages, and even so.
I belatedly apologize.
Yes, I accept. Actually, we apologize for not being able to do it. I'll answer my own question for you. Actually, you did, I think, with some others of your generation, introduce Japanese literature to the world in such a way that it became part of world literature. It's no longer exotic. It's all over the world now. I mean, it's in the bookstores, and without those translations of everything from the earlier works to the modern ones, that was important to have the whole span. Is there anything that you wish you had done differently, or wish you had done that you didn't?
I shouldn't sound self-satisfied.
Go ahead.
But I think I did what I could when I could, and I was enormously helped by the willingness of publishers. At that time, they were better off than they are today to cooperate with me. So when I did a book on No, another book on Bunraku, they were produced beautifully.
Yeah.
At very reasonable price. It'd be impossible to publish the same book now, except for $150, $200, who knows? But that in those days it was possible, and I was extremely lucky in that way. I was fantastically lucky exactly when I began what I was doing. If I had been working in 1935, let us see, it would have been hopeless. People were not interested. They would have, the publishers would not have published the books that I did. If on the other hand, I'd been started my work in 1960, by then there was already a large number of things that were available. The work of a pioneer was not possible. But when I started, except for Whaley, Great Whaley, I had no predecessors. I felt that way. I was going on my own, nothing in the way, nothing to worry about. No, perfectly clear. Everything I did was for the first time. It was a exotic, but it was a marvelous feeling. And I looked at the list of what people got PhDs in English literature about. So it said, the reputation of Chaucer in Spain. Well, I think that would, if we were doing that in Japanese studies, it would come in another millennium.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So what is your next? Right now, you're writing a book on Masaoka Shiki.
Yes.
Meiji poet. That's soon to be finished. What do you think you might do next?
I've been asked whether I'd be interested in writing about Hiraga Gennai.
Oh, please do.
And
please do.
I'm very much interested in Hiraga Gennai. He figures in the book you mentioned already, The Japanese Discovery of Europe. And I'm crazy about eccentrics.
He fills the bill.
And he's certainly a fine eccentric. Masaoka Shiki is not eccentric at all. He's a fascinating character and an unbelievable character who wrote most of his work more or less chained to his bed, unable to sit, unable to stand, who wrote up that way with his brush. That was the only way he could write, and who nevertheless kept going and kept writing until 3 days before he died. Well, he's another extraordinary figure, and it's been fun for me to explore each of these people I had known from a few works, and now getting to know them better, I appreciate their dimensions.
Well, I really hope you do write about Hiraga Gennai because he's a treat. I mean,
Yeah.
there aren't very many like him in any place. Now you're having abandoned us after 73 years. I don't know how you could do it. And you're going back to Japan, and you will not be teaching in the spring anymore. So what kinds of things will you be doing, you think, in Japan?
I really don't know. I want to work on my own work. That's always terribly important, the most important thing to me. But it will be very hard for me. I can anticipate if people say, "Please come to this place which was hit by the earthquake. Please give a lecture there." I imagine this will happen many times, and I will feel that that's the one thing I can do, and I will do it. But this will last at least for some months anyway. And then, presuming my mind is still okay, I will devote myself to Hiraga Gennai, if that's my work, and I will try not to give too many lectures. and not too many, and not write too many unimportant little articles.
Well, you have a very poor record at saying no to anyone. So my guess is that because you lecture from one end of Japan to the other, you'll go anywhere. And so I think you'll certainly continue to do that. I've never known you to say no. But I hope that you'll have some time for yourself. I mean, you work every day anyway. I mean, my husband always says, what book is Donald finishing today? So I'm sure you will continue with your work. And what about, how do you see now, after so many years of acquaintance with Japanese literature and culture, where do you see Japanese literature and culture in the world today? I mean, how do you think it's changed over these many years? Itself, not so much as the view of it.
It has been accepted on the terms of modern literature. Let's just say, when somebody buys a book by Murakami Haruki, they're not hoping for something exotic or beautiful or filled with cherry blossoms and maple leaves. They want a book that corresponds to other things that interest them in other countries' literature. So this is, in a sense, is a step forward. It's Japanese has become accepted as one of the international literatures. It also somehow makes one feel a little bit sad that some of the things that I have that first attracted me to Japanese literature, the beauty of Japanese language itself, the beauty of the imagery and the poetry and so on, these may be sacrificed, or they may become simply the sort of things that one finds on greeting cards, pretty, lovely little scenes, lovely little poem, but nothing behind it. It's going to be a difficult choice for the Japanese now, how far they want to become mixed with the rest of the world, or whether they want to be as little that way as possible, or whether another possibility, they will seek closer relations with China and Korea.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the prospects for that? In terms of the Japanese literature today, do you read much of the contemporary things? I don't think you don't read cell phone novels, I'm guessing.
No, I don't.
I thought that might be the case. But do you read any? Are there any contemporary works in theater or fiction that you read with interest?
I read some when I have reason to know from a friend's recommendation, reading a book review or something else, mm-hmm. That a certain book is exceptionally interesting. I will read it. For example, there's a writer who must be in his 30s now, Hirano Koichiro. Mm-hmm. I remember reading somewhere that people were thinking of him as the next Mishima. And so that intrigued me. And I read his first book, which was a book about alchemists in France in the medieval period. And it was really extraordinary tour de force. Yeah. I've met him since and find him a very interesting, likable man who is very modern, but at the same time has a great knowledge of his own culture and also of European culture. Such a man, I think, is promising, and I hope that he will continue.
Mm. Is there anything translated of his, do you think?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. Mm. Well, I think that both everything that you've done up until now and everything you're going to do will be, for your readers, I think, a wonderful gift. So we're grateful for that. I'd like, if it's okay with you, to open the floor to questions. If you would wait, please, for the microphone before you speak. And I must say that, there they go, the lights. So if you raise your hand, I can perhaps recognize you and the microphone will follow. Questions?
Thank you very much, Dr. Keene. I'm quite scared to ask a question. So instead, I would like to ask you to give me a little lecture of your translation of Basho's 古池や買わず飛び込む水の音. I just like to listen to your a little lecture.
This is not a test.
I'm not sure I'm quoting myself correctly. The ancient pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. This doesn't sound like very much in English. And curiously, Masaoka Shiki said, there's nothing more to this poem except what it says. There are no other dimensions to it. Nothing is being suggested. But I find this a profound poem which has many ways of being read. The first thing about it is Furuike, the old pond. It's curious. Why old pond? Aren't all ponds old? Are there such things as new ponds? Furuike, he must have wanted to say this. It's very important to make this pond an old pond. The word Furuike was not used before. This is the first time it's used, as far as I know. Kawazu ga tobu komo. The frog jumps in. Mizu no oto. Well, you have here something which is eternal. Furuikeya. It lasts forever. And then there's something that happens once. A frog jumps in. It doesn't happen over and over again. It won't happen tomorrow. It happens just one time in the course of history. So we have something which is eternal, level, and something which is vertical, temporary, bisecting it. And what happens when the two come together? Mizuno oto. I think that this must have been a basho of mine. It's like much else in his writings. If you take the surface meaning, you may be disappointed, and you certainly be disappointed by most of the English translations. But if you think it over carefully, you can see that every word was carefully chosen, and it all leads to something much more than 17 syllables.
I can't see. Here's a question here.
The role of women in
Would you speak louder?
the role of women in Heian period literature was very, very important. Since then, have women figured a great deal in Japanese literature?
The importance of women in Japanese literature, the Heian period, is probably unique in the history of the world. There's no other country for such a long period when women have written the most important works. Not only Seisho Nagon and Murasaki Shikibu, but many of the poets too. After this period, we have, at the beginning of the Kamakura period, we still have some of the fragrance of that period left in the poetry, but almost nothing in prose. And then, for a long period, there's no prose written by women which has been preserved. It's not until the Meiji period that we again find women coming to the fore, and then extraordinarily with Higuchi Ichio, who was an extraordinary writer, and even in her own time was respected as unusual and superior to the men writers. Today, women are very active in literature. If you go to a bookshop, there's a section always for books by women, but this is becoming less and less meaningful because there are books by women everywhere, not only in this particular section.
Yes, over there.
Thank you so much for your words, and I'm so happy to be here. And kind of my dream that meet you. Actually, I have a big fan of Shiba Ryotaro. Please let me know about friendship or relations with him, and tell us the feeling about him from your point of view.
Your relations with him and what you think about his work.
Shiba Ryotaro is the closest thing to a hero in modern Japan. His books are always on in bookshops. There's always a section for his books. Everybody reads them, from the most difficult, demanding scholar down to a very unlettered boy. He's fantastically popular. He is admired by everyone. I knew him not very well, but I did know him. We were friendly, and he was very kind to me. On certainly, I respected him, and I felt affection for him. I would like nothing more than to translate his works, if I thought they were suitable. This is a problem. The books most of his works are very long, and they also assume a knowledge of something about Japanese history. If you don't know anything about Japanese history, and you read what he has written, it'd probably be puzzling. One of his major works was translated about 5 years ago. It was refused by every single publisher. No publisher would touch it. It was much too long. It was said that they said that if it was reduced, if it was cut, it might be possible to publish it. But Shiba's widow refuses to allow any changes to be made. A new translation of the same work as Sakano no Kumo.
Russo-Japanese War book. This is the Russo-Japanese War book, right?
Yes.
Sakano no Kumo.
It is now being retranslated. Perhaps another translation will make it better. But it seems to me that Shiba is a necessary writer for the Japanese. He responds to a need the Japanese feel to know about their own history, their own great people, their own achievements, and is satisfied by these books by a man who writes beautifully, who is extremely intelligent, who has a lot of information. I think it'd be much harder to find the same public in this country, but I may be wrong. I hope I am wrong. I hope that the new translation of Sakano no Kumo becomes a bestseller. I really liked Shiba Ryotaro, and he was a truly splendid man. I would like anything at all to have his fame extend to this country too.
Well, we're having trouble with the new translation because it's so long, and some of us have been saying you need to publish it. It's not going to be a bestseller, but it needs to be translated. We don't know yet. It's a problem because of the form. You know, it's so that they're just too long. The works are too long. So, other questions? Here and then there. Yeah.
Hi, I'm really honored to be able to ask you the question. Aside from literature, I find it very frustrating to try to translate nuances and certain sentiment in Japanese culture. And I was wondering if you would share your secret in terms of, translating, interpreting those sentiments without 100 footnotes.
What's your secret? How is it that you managed to translate Japanese literature and capture the nuance without a lot of scholarly apparatus and those awful brackets?
One way of doing it is to go over your manuscript again and again until you can find satisfaction in it. Sometimes, as in my case, in the case of Dazai Osamu, I had no trouble translating like that, but other times I've had to work. I've had to struggle to get something to sound natural, to make it sound the way human beings would say it. I try to think of a good example. Let's say in a novel, somebody, a man hears a noise in the next room, and he doesn't know what it is. He says, "Nisan janai desu ka? Isn't it you, elder brother?" But in the West, we never say to a brother, elder brother. We never call anybody elder brother or younger brother. We call them by name. And if the text doesn't have a name, what do you do then? How do you get around that? Well, there are different ways you can do. But the first thing is you must always think in terms of this must sound natural. This is what I would say. This is the way. If I was trying to say the same thing, I would say it. And anything that sounds cute or picturesque is probably wrong. You should have something which is natural, spontaneous. This is not much of a help to you, I know, but again and again, when one comes across problems of difficult things to say. I had a problem of a different time, which was in a play of Mishima. It was Ayano Tsuzumi, one of his modern no plays. He had one character who's known as, she's a dressmaker. She's known as the Madam. And there's another character in the play who's also called Madam. But we just can't do that in English. So he had to give a name to the other lady, the customer. So finally I said to Mishima, you must give me a name for this character. And he gave one. So if you look at my translation and you look at the original, you say, how did he get that? But that was one from the author himself.
I'll tell you one other secret that makes your translation so incredible is that you never skip a word. I mean, the way you make it natural is that you understand the original so completely that you don't, I mean, the test of translation from Japanese is the parts that people skip. He never skips a word, ever. Even if in complicated Michiyuki and Chikamatsu, that's a secret too, I think. That's how you get to your natural prose. Yes, behind you, you first, I think, yeah.
Professor Keene, would you be so kind to say a few words about a favorite author of mine, is Kawabata Yasunari?
When Kawabata Yasunari won the Nobel Prize, I for one was disappointed. I was hoping that Mishima would get it. And I think that other people were surprised. Japanese were very surprised, thinking this is a writer who is so Japanese, he can't possibly be understood by people in other countries. But both of us were wrong. In retrospect now, I feel that Kawabata fully deserved the prize at that time and any other time. And I think, too, that the foreign readers who must approach it in translation, fortunately the translations are very good, that they get a great deal from it. It is not beyond their comprehension. He is an extraordinary writer. The more I read him, the more I feel attracted to his style and to his skills. I'm very fortunate that I knew him quite well, and he was another writer I was treated with a kindness quite inexplicable, considering at that time I was completely unknown.
Do you have a mic there? If I'm not seeing you, raise your hand higher, because I'm having a hard time seeing.
Thank you, Dr. Keene. I'm a high school English teacher, and actually one of the things that has been impressing me and my students is after the earthquake and the tsunami, the resilience of the Japanese people in coming back, even things like the picture in the New York Times of portable baths set up so people could get back to their way of just normal life. And I'm wondering if you could say a couple words about the notion of resilience in Japanese culture and how that may or may not be there from way back, and something that I could share with my students about that idea.
I've tried very hard in last months to explain to people why the Japanese behave so extraordinarily well after the disasters that took place. It would have been a simple explanation to say, well, it's the Confucian tradition. And maybe that's not a mistake, but there are other countries with a Confucian tradition who don't act exactly the same way. I really don't understand it myself, but I think it's something ingrained in the Japanese to think that after the terrible things that were going on, that there was no case of looting, no case of wanton destruction. All the things that have accompanied disasters in other countries were missing. This is phenomenal. It must represent something very deep in the Japanese. I can't give you the source. It'd be simple if I could say it was Confucianism or Buddhism or Shinto. But I can't give you those reasons because they don't seem to me sufficient to explain what is quite a unique experience in the history of recent times. Like everyone else, I was struck with deep admiration for what the Japanese suffered and emerged from, and how they're still contending with it. And I thought, how is it possible? And I don't know. I'm sorry I can't help you.
One more question. Here.
Professor Keene, coming at the time that the news of your decision to seek Japanese citizenship, although you'd made the decision earlier, it came, I guess, to a lot of the public after the big Tohoku crisis. And I was wondering how, in hindsight, you thought your closest friends, such as perhaps Mishima, if you were alive today, or Tsunoda Sensei, or Shimanaka of Chuokoro, might think about your decision to become a Japanese citizenship. Would they have been surprised? Would they think, oh, finally? And I'm also wondering, given how the Japanese often have this penchant of saying, can this person really understand Japan? Dikai. No one has come closer than you to understanding Japan. I think a lot of Japanese even credit you for that. But do you think that your past scholarship, the perception of your scholarship and what you produced will change as a result of your having become a Japanese citizenship, albeit a blue-eyed Taro Kaja, I guess as you once called it? And what kanji would you choose for your name if you became one?
Well, I thought in January, February this year, I was seriously ill while I was in Tokyo. And I was in a hospital there. The first week I was in a daze. of high fever, didn't know what was going on, but gradually I became aware of myself. And I thought seriously, what am I going to do with my remaining years? I was then 88. Next week I will be 89. And I decided that I really wanted to stay in Japan, a country with which I've been so closely associated. I don't think there's been one day since I was 18 years old, 19 years old, when I haven't thought about Japan in one way or another. I didn't think seriously about citizenship until one day it occurred to me that this might be a way of expressing my gratitude to the Japanese for all they've done for me, for all the Japanese I knew, and for many Japanese I never knew. I made this decision all by myself without consulting anybody. I don't know what my friends would have thought about it. None of my friends has opposed it. None of them even said, "You may regret this." Nothing of that sort. I think everyone assumed it's quite natural in my case that I've been so closely associated with the Japanese, that I want to be without borders, without any kind of difference between me and them.
And the character for your name? And the kanji for your name?
Yes. But the one good thing that has been very precious to me is that I've had many letters from people I don't know saying that my decision has given them courage. I'm not worthy of that, but to give anybody courage is a good thing. And so I'm very happy I've done that.
Well, I'd like to say